Are you ready to take your team to the next level? Introducing the Buy-in Rocks method, the ultimate tool for unlocking unity and success within your organization and team. Picture this, a workplace where everyone is aligned, working together towards a common goal. With the Buy-in Rocks method, that dream can become a reality. But okay, what is exactly the Buy-in Rocks method? Well, it's a 5-phase approach designed to help you proactively plan, provide clarity, and get buy-in from your team. With the Rocks format, you'll simplify the work and sustain your progress toward your goals like never before. But it's not just about strategies, y'all. It's about building a positive culture where everyone is invested in the why, how, and what of your goals. Don't let disunity hold your team back. Visit leadershipontherocks.com/buy-in to download your free Buy-in Rocks planning template today. Unlock the power of unity within your team with the Buy-in Rocks method. Visit leadershipontherocks.com/buy-in. Leadership on the Rocks is guiding you towards success, one buy-in at a time.
The term leadership shock really came to me as because I kept working with leaders that had the same symptoms, and their symptoms were their calendar was out of control. Like they had no time, they were working on the weekends, their teams were confused. Most importantly, they just didn't feel like they were doing a good job. And so leadership shock is just like being physical shock. Like your blood pumps, like you're breathing, but you can't actually do anything.
This is the Leadership on the Rocks podcast, where we equip and empower leaders like you to thrive in and create harmony between your professional and personal lives. I'm your host, Bethany Reese, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking with coach and author Pete Steinberg about how to overcome leadership shock. Pete Steinberg is a leadership and innovation expert with extensive experience consulting with top Fortune 500 professionals. He also has more than 20 years of experience as an elite rugby coach, coaching the USA women's rugby team at 2 World Cups and the Rio Olympics. Wow. Now, as a former U.S. international and Olympics coach and commentator for major outlets such as CBS, ESPN, and Fox Sports, Pete has a track record of bringing teams to victory. He's won 11 national championships with the Penn State women, Marfu men, and Temple women rugby teams. Pete is also the president of Innovative Thought, a business consultancy focused on leadership and organizational development. He supports clients in the areas of innovation, leadership, strategic planning, marketing, recruiting, and organizational development. Pete works regularly as an executive coach for senior executives of global companies and just released the book, Leadership Shock, Using Authenticity to Navigate the Hidden Dangers of Career Success. Pete holds affiliated faculty positions at the Tepper Business School at Carnegie Mellon University and the Smeal College of Business at Penn State. Welcome to the Leadership on the Rocks podcast, Mr. Steinberg. I'm so excited to have you.
I'm excited to be here.
And all right, so I got to start off with your amazing sports career. I love sports. They've heard me talk about a lot of sports and how it ties into leadership on the podcast. So I want to tap into all of that experience. And I want to know, with being involved so heavily in sports as a coach, what has sports taught you about people, number one, and then 2, leading people?
Well, I actually really struggle to separate my sports knowledge and my business knowledge. So for 20 years, I did both. I was a consultant and I was an elite coach. And so they kind of merge. So I'm not, so I struggle now to understand where it came from. But I will say this with elite athletes. And I think as coaches, the most important thing is to understand what the athlete wants to get out of their experience and then help them get it. And I think that transfers exactly to leading people. I think people are motivated. If you want someone to be at their absolute best, you have to find a way to really align to what they're trying to accomplish. And on leadership, this is interesting. I don't often use sports as an analogy with my clients, even though like that's a big part of my background, but rugby actually is pretty different than most sports, particularly in America, in the sense when I coached at the 2017 World Cup, I was up in the stands. So
Wow.
I'm not on the sideline. I'm not calling in plays. I'm not managing anything. And so as a rugby coach, what you actually have to do is you have to very much empower your team to be able to make tactical, strategic decisions, to manage the culture, to lead each other, to maximize their performance. And so the big thing I learned in that process is you have to, if you want to empower your team, what you have to do is you have to give them space. You have to let them do things their way. And sometimes, hopefully, it works out. Most of the time, it'll work out, but not the way you thought it was going to work out. But if you don't give them that time and space to actually lead, then they're not going to take on that responsibility, and they won't be empowered. So the example is when you coach rugby, particularly at World Cup in the 15-a-side game, on game day, I had nothing to do. Like by the time we get to game day, it like I go off, have a coffee. Like the players have to manage that. So recognizing that you have to give space to your team if you want them to really lead themselves and be empowered is probably the thing on the leadership side.
That's amazing. And think about the release of control, which is really hard for A-type go-getter leaders.
I will, like I say this in 2017 at the World Cup, and we got to the semifinals. It was the first time in 20 years that the US women had got to the semifinals of the World Cup, so it was very successful. I think I probably used the sports psychologists that we had on site more than the players did. Like releasing control. I was like the nerves that you have when you can't control something is much greater than the nerves that you have when you actually have. So like on game day, it was really hard. Like to keep myself grounded. It was very, very hard.
I totally get that. And even in parenting, and I won't go on a huge, rabbit trail here, but I have a kid that I sent off to college and like talking about like releasing control. Fly, little bird, and I hope you make it. I get
it. I want to go down that rabbit hole just a little bit further, because someone who coached college athletes for a long time, what I would say is that, and this links to leadership. If you want to empower your team or your kid to make good choices, you need to give them the opportunity to make those choices when you're there. So when you're not there, they have the experience that you need. And so what I saw a lot when I was coaching college athletes, like high school kids would come in and they actually had I remember there was a very talented athlete. She didn't play rugby. She played field hockey in high school. And she came in and she was really struggling. She would be at practice and she would be exhausted. And I realized that, I sat down, I had a conversation with her, and she actually had no skills to manage her life because her parents had always done it for her. She didn't know when to go to bed. She didn't know how to get up. She didn't know how to like manage her time in between, like because her parents had like when you talk to her, what was your senior year in high school? It was her parents did everything for her. So when she got to college, she didn't have what we might call basic life skills. And so she had to learn basic life skills at college. By then it's too late. So that's on the parenting side, but also on the leadership side. Like it's a journey to empower your team. It's not a moment.
I agree. And, I tap into that with leadership and I'm like, you have to equip them before you empower them. Otherwise they don't have the skill set, like you said. And I love that. I call that like gradual release, right? It's a gradual release. As you learn the skill set, the more, freedom and responsibility and control that you can take in that. So
here's the thing. I think that is really, it's really challenging for leaders, right? And the reason why letting go is so hard is because often the self-identity of the leader is in the expert space. So it is,
preach.
and therefore I think, and this actually, it does link to leadership shock. When people get to more senior leadership levels and their identity has been stuck in the expert space, they feel the need to still do the job they had before. Even though they are now in a more senior role, as opposed to changing the way they see themselves and therefore the way they lead to a bigger role.
Yeah. I just see, whenever we think of promotions, I mean, I'm a visual thinker. I think of, you're climbing up the mountain, right? And you're being promoted up leadership. But as you start on that journey, you're carrying a bunch of tasks, a bunch of rocks, a bunch of, things that are required of you. But as you keep walking up the mountain, if you keep picking up more rocks and not releasing others, that's going to be a heavy load. and you can't do it. You gotta relinquish, you gotta release that. And I love all the points you're bringing up. Guys, all of that is for free. All of the parallels between parenting and leadership. We didn't even plan on getting there. So thank you so much for your wisdom in that.
Oh,
You mentioned
it's
leadership.
okay. I have a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old, Bethany. So I'm
Oh,
talking a good game, but when my kids are teenagers, I'm going to be calling you and be like, what happened? I thought
I
I had this
totally,
thing done, but what happened? So
I know, I totally have been there, and I still have a teenager at home, so I'm still living the life. You mentioned leadership shock, and you just wrote the book, Leadership Shock: Using Authenticity to Navigate the Hidden Dangers of Career Success. When I hear that word, leadership shock, I have been in leadership, and I even had a skip level promotion. And that word, shock, yes. Oh my gosh. Yes, I felt all of that, everything about that word. So will you just explain what you mean by leadership shock? Because even in hearing that, I identify with it, even though I'm not 100% sure like what you mean by it yet.
yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, and the term leadership shock really came to me as because I kept working with leaders that had the same symptoms. And their symptoms were their calendar was out of control. Like they had no time. They were working on the weekends. Their teams were confused. Most importantly, they just didn't feel like they were doing a good job. And so leadership shock is just like being in physical shock. Like your blood pumps, like you're breathing, but you can't actually do anything. And that's actually what leadership shock is. So people exist in their leadership roles, but they're not making the impact that they want to make. And that's because there has been some contextual change. In most cases, it's a transition, right? It's I've been
Mm,
successful in a role, and now I've been given a role, and a double level promotion is like double shock, right? Because what's made me successful in my previous role is likely not to make me successful in my next role, but that's what I
yes.
know. And therefore, that's
Mhm.
what I do. And all of a sudden, I'm not being successful anymore, and I'm really struggling. And so leadership shock. And by the way, like I said, it's contextual. So sometimes the market can change, my boss can change, there's a reorganization. Something
Mhm.
around me has changed, but I have not changed the way I've led or the way I'm leading. And therefore, the world has exploded. I'm fighting fires. I'm
Mhm.
never able to really get a handle on the job. And I'm never able to move kind of like the ball down the street, trying to get to where and accomplish what I want to accomplish.
Oh man. And I just think of the psychology behind we don't like change. We love comfort. Like who moved my cheese? I mean, all of these things that are
Completely.
being written about it. It's so important for that very reason because we don't like change. We like what's comfortable. But what got us here to this point will not get us there where we're going in the future, right? You could think about all these things that you've heard in leadership, but it's so true. It's universally true in everything from parenting, what we've already talked about, into
Yeah,
leadership,
I
which
think
we're
that's
talking
right.
about now.
And it's a continuum. So it's not
Yeah.
binary. It's not like I'm in shock or I'm not in shock. I was actually talking to someone who read the book, and they said, "Wow, this really resonates with me, right?" And it resonates with me, and it makes me think about my boss differently and all these sorts of things.
Hmm.
And as we were talking, I think like I came to the conclusion that like we're probably always in a little bit of shock. And often we're in shock in moments because
Hmm.
there's a crisis, there's something we've got to solve. So I think being crazy, having a crazy calendar, not being able to get after things strategically over the short term is probably normal, right? There's
Yeah.
something that's happened, market changes. There's been some downside. Like something's happened in the short term. It's going to be a bit crazy. The problem is when, it's okay to be in leadership shock for the next
Hmm.
2 weeks. It's not okay to be in leadership shock for the next 6 months, right? And if you're in leadership shock for the
Yeah.
next 6 months, there's something more fundamental to what you're doing. And when I work with clients, the benefit, and I love Bethany, the way you've said like the term resonates with you, is that when I work with clients, they'll be like, oh, I'm in shock right now.
Hmm.
Like we've got this big thing happening, like everything's crazy. I'm just in shock, but I know it, right? And I know it's
Yes.
going to be short term, and therefore it's more effective and it's more sustainable.
That's awesome. And thinking about everything that you just said, I'm like, yes, I feel like you were a doctor, like giving me the list of all the symptoms that I have felt at one point in my career. And I'm like, yes, I have been there, done that, felt that. But I love how you distinguish in you're going to go through that feeling, and it could be short term, and that's normal and that's natural. It's when it's long term that it's not. Uh, and so as you're helping us work through, wait, am I in leadership shock? Because we know we don't like change. We have that shock whenever change happens. How do we become comfortable with the uncomfortable that change and transition can bring?
Well, and this is actually something that links back that I learned from elite sport. So if you're a coach or you're an athlete and you want to go to the Olympics, everything that you do has to be aligned to your purpose, right? You like, we're going to go to the Olympics and we're going to perform at our best. And you feel the pressure of time. You're like, oh, Olympics is 6 months away. Oh, it's
Yeah.
3 months away. Oh, the Olympics is 3 days away. Everything that you're doing from 6 months, like the time that you spend 6 months away from the Olympics is as important as the time that's 3 days before the Olympics. And so the idea of being intentional takes away the sense of shock because you're taking control. It doesn't mean you're controlling the environment, but you're being intentional about how you lead. So you're like, I understand the world I work in is chaotic. I understand that there are outcomes that I can't control, but I am going to be intentional. So intentionality, leading in a very intentional way, spending your time and prioritizing where you want to put your focus intentionally is the way to get out of leadership shock. Now, how you choose your priorities and how you choose the way you want to lead, that's what the authentic leadership model is. And that's what's in leadership shock. And it's a framework to get leaders to think, to get to that intentionality at the end.
I love it. And just hearing that authentic leadership model. I love your word choice, and it really does mean a lot. Authenticity means I get to be me. I'm not having to pose, fake, or deal with
Right.
anything else. So it feels good to just be me. And then you're also providing structure. So can you dive into that for us a little bit? What is exactly
Sure.
the authentic leadership model?
Sure. So, and I'm going to come back to something that you said, Bethany, that I think is really critical, which is um, there's no certainty in the model. It's all ambiguous, right? But if we're learners and we're intentional, we can adjust, right? If we're knowers, which is like, I know the way I want to lead, right? And I'm not going to be intentional about what I do, then it's actually hard to grow. So it's really
Yeah.
a growth model. It's a way of really being specific, but it's authentic because it starts with the belief of the leader, right? So it starts with their purpose. Like, what fills your emotional tank? What do you want to accomplish in this world? Like, not in your role, but more holistically.
Yeah.
It's authentic because it brings what's the strengths that you bring to the role. Now, it's important. It's what strengths do you bring to this role? So to our point before, it's not strengths that you bring to your last role. So being an expert in finance, and
Yeah.
now you're the CFO, being an expert in finance is actually not a required role to be a good CFO. You need people on your team that are experts on finance. You are now a
Nice.
leader. So part of it is changing the mindset of the leader to what's important for their role now. And then what are your leadership beliefs? Why, what do you believe great leaders do? And so that's the authentic piece that sits in the model. And then there's two things that are contextual. So one is, what's the role that you have? Now, this isn't the job description, right? This is like, no, what's actually expected of you? Are you
I've
expected to speak
never
up?
seen a job description that was actual.
Exactly. Right,
That's
right.
exactly
Like,
what
like,
you
like none of
did.
them are contextual, right?
Yeah.
So
No.
it's like, does your supervisor expect you to speak up? Do they expect to be challenged? Right? Do they expect you to bring new ideas? Like, what is the expectation that the organization has of the role? And then what are you trying to accomplish? So what's the vision? Where do you want to be 3 years from now? Like, for you and your team. So those things are all interdependent. And so the way it works through in the book is you work through each of those. You follow a fable, Michael, who's a newly promoted CEO, and you go through each of those pieces. But at the end, you have some questions that say, hey, here's how you think through it. But the important thing is to recognize, then you go back and say, oh, how does this link to my purpose? How does this link to my vision? It's all iterative. And then you use all of that and you analyze it. And then that allows you to come out, where do I want to spend my time? Time is so important. It is a non-renewable resource. We don't treat it like that. We give away our time cheaply all the time, all the time.
Amen.
In fact,
yes.
The hardest thing for me to do when I start working with a client who's in leadership shop is find time to meet, because they don't have any time because they're in leadership shop.
Yeah.
I had a CEO, chief of staff come to me one time, and this is like Michael's an amalgamation of lots of different clients, but this actually happened that the chief of staff came to me and said the CEO's calendar is booked for 6 months. I'm like, oh no, they're busy. And the chief of staff is like, no, it is booked for 6 months, right? And that's because that CEO did not really, I think I can argue, value their time. I mean, they had leadership principles that were, they ran a business unit. They had leadership principles that worked when running the business unit, but did not work when running 8 business units.
Yeah.
Right. Like you have to be different. And their time got filled up, but also they didn't see their time as their most precious resource, and they didn't judge how they should use their time relative for the return. Right. And so they found themselves in meetings that weren't actually valuable to the organization. So you will come out with a better understanding of your priorities, and you will come out with a better understanding of how you want to lead. I call them leadership principles, like the principles. And this is something that came from sport, where my teams would have principles of play, which would guide them for their decisions about how they wanted to do something. And so these are leadership principles. So these are like 3 or 4 things that say, this is how I want to lead. And I can be held accountable to them.
That's awesome. You know what I visualize as you're talking? Leadership is such a messy, foggy existence. And as you talked a lot about purpose, about, who am I and how do I want to lead, but then also tapping into what does the role require of me? Because this role and this role could be different. It's like you're building, stacking rocks to stand on to get above the fog to gain major clarity into the priorities. And then as you start to see things, then you gain this huge empowerment of saying, nope, not worth my time. Nope, not valuable. It's like growing the backbone.
Well, this actually goes all the way back to the early part of our discussion, because it's not no, it's not me. Right. So these things that come up isn't no. It's like, that is not where my priority is. It's not me. It's someone on my team. Right. So the things that are on someone's calendar when they have shock, it's not that they shouldn't be done. It's just the leader doesn't know if they should do it or not. Right. And so I think it is, again, it's about giving space. Often they'll find themselves in meetings where actually, do they need to be in that meeting, or can someone on their team lead that meeting? Right. And I used to be in that meeting. I was in that meeting. I used to lead that meeting, and now I've been promoted. I still want to be in that meeting. That's what I know. That's what I'm good at. No. That's not you. Right. That's not you, leader. That's someone on your team gets that experience to run that meeting. You have to pull yourself out of that meeting. And so
I love the
think
distinction.
So I think it goes back to that empowerment piece, which is, as you work your way up, there are fewer and fewer meetings that you should be in, and there's more and more delegation that you have to do.
Absolutely, because your scope has grown immensely. Right. Like, it's exponential.
Right. There's no way you could be in all the meetings. I worked with a leader recently, and she said, got promoted to a C-suite role. And she said, well, my leadership has always been the first, like, I cannot, I have to really understand. I have to dive deep into things to really understand them. And I was like, well, then you're going to have a problem. Like, there's too much here for you to understand. Right. So you need to get more comfortable representing things to the C-suite and the board that you don't own, that aren't yours, but you trust your team that what they've given you is the right stuff. And that's the difference between being a manager and being a leader.
Oh, absolutely. I could see that. Trust is so valuable, but oftentimes we don't trust. And that's why we're fighting for this control is you can't do it as well as I can. But the higher you go, you're not meant to do that. That work is not meant for you.
and in most cases, they can do it as well as you can do it, just not the way you would do it. And that's the other thing. So this goes back, like, if I'm really intentional with here are the 4 things that I'm going to do, and I'm not going to do anything else. Right now, there are other things I'm going to have to do because they're organizational requirements and things like that. But in my discretionary time, which is probably like 30 to 50% of my calendar, this is where I'm going to focus. And the other things that need to happen, I'm going to get someone else to do. Right.
Yes.
And so part of this is saying these are the 4 things that are really important. Right. These other things that my teams are doing are important, but they're not like this prioritized. It's true prioritization. Right. They're all important. But what are the 4 things that you can do? And sometimes it's, and this again in the model goes back to what's the value I provide or the strengths, like what's the value that I provide, and therefore what can I do in my role that no one on my team can do. I might have access to other leaders that they don't have. I might be able to unblock things. Like I might be able to spend more time doing something or have, more visibility, right? Or bring this up to the C-suite. There are things that I can do that my team can't do. That has to be part of your prioritization. It can't just be, what do I want to do? Right?
Yeah.
I want to do this. But it has to be it really has to be very intentional.
And you know what I heard? I heard advocacy. I heard support for your team, unblocking things. That's huge. If people at the C-suite level could just communicate well, I find that the miscommunication at the C-suite level is what blocks up so much of the work below because people aren't talking. People are not communicating. So the advocacy, the communication, the unblocking, I think that's such good leadership because you're supporting and allowing your people that you serve to do the work and do it well because you're removing those obstacles for them. And I think that's just so huge.
There's 2 things that I heard recently that I'm not going to claim ownership of. So one is from Adam Russell. He's a colleague that does some he's an amazing guy. He like works at the highest level of government. He also does AI work. He's just amazing. And he said something in a plenary of a program for a client that was that really hit me, which is said, the more senior you get, the harder it is to keep empathy. So what's really hard for the C-suite is to actually empathize what it was like to not be in the C-suite. And I was
That's such a great point.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that before. And the other thing came from a client, new CEO, and his comment was, the hardest thing for me to get is honest feedback.
Oh yeah, it's the
goes,
emperor with no clothes. Nobody will tell you the truth.
No one wants to tell me I'm not doing well. No one wants to tell me. And he was really feeling this as a new CEO. I mean, he was a C-suite CEO of a publicly traded company. He was a C-suite executive at a Fortune 500. Like he's been at senior levels, and he's like, but the interesting thing is, once you become CEO, no one wants to tell you bad news. No one wants to tell you bad news about the business. No one wants to tell you bad news about what you're doing. He said, feedback is the most valuable asset that I can find. And I thought that those 2 things are both like they're linked, right? So one is, it's harder to understand what it's like to be not at a senior leadership level. Yeah. And then the second thing is, it's harder to get the information that I need to have, right? Like the communication. So it's partly, how does the C-suite communicate, but also how do they create channels so they can get the information they need that is like absolutely the best data so they can make the best choices. And both of those things, I think, are really challenging.
Absolutely. Another thing that I'm thinking of is, we talk about how you adapt to change or transitions and how what got you here won't get you there and the new skills that you need. I think of just rabbits and things like that. Like, I think it's called adaptation in the animal kingdom, in the animal world of, if you don't adapt to the environment, if you don't, learn to flex with it, then you will eventually break or die out.
Well, I think so. No, I think that's right. And so what's really interesting to me, and we do some work with clients on this too, in particular internal, is I'm going to take it back. We have a metric problem when it comes to performance. We don't know how to measure the important things. And this happens in sport, right? Like, so in sport, a team that wins, we're like, oh, team that wins, good team. Nope. The team that loses and still plays its best, great team. Great culture, like that. But our metric, we don't know how to measure that. We don't know how to measure how great the culture is or how great the leadership is. So what we do is we look at the score. The same thing happens when we're recruiting or we're selecting for leadership, is that we actually often do the things that we can measure. So we measure experience, which is a really like, you should almost never select someone based on only on their experience. Sometimes it's
Yeah.
important, but most of the time it's not, because 6 months into the role, they have all the experience they need.
Yeah.
And we do it on skills, things that are tangible, right? Things that we can see. Those are actually very easily changed. So if you want to select someone, you need to select on mindset, how do they think, and attributes, right? What they
Oh, I
bring to
love
the
it.
table. Mindset and attributes are really hard to change. But because we select on experience and skills, especially internally, it gets to something, Bethany, that you were talking about, is we select something not on the skills for the new role. We select them on the skills for their old role. So we take their experience in their old role, you know, so we look for a new CFO. So we look at all the vice presidents of, like, you know, of finance in all of our business units, and we say, well, who's done the best job there? And we say, oh, you have shown the skills to be a VP of finance for one of the business units. We're going to make you CFO.
Yeah.
Terrible. Like, what? Those jobs are different. Like, to being good at that job doesn't make you good at this job. But if you look at all the VPs in finance and say, who's an enterprise-wide thinker? Right? Who's a really good communicator? Right? Who are some of these, like, what are these attributes that they bring? Who's a colleague? Who's a really good colleague? Like who's really good at being honest? And like, what are the attributes that the CFO needs? Then you look at the VPs of finance and say, well, which of those have those attributes? It probably isn't the person who's the best VP of finance.
Exactly. I love that you're distinguishing the difference. We often will take their hard skills, their knowledge of that, expertise in one specific area, and we project it into the next level. And everything that you're saying is so true. And I'm not picking on engineers, but it's a little easier one to say. Engineers have hardcore maths and design skills, right? But do they always have people skills? Not so much, but they're going to take, for the most part, it's just comfortable. It's quick. It's easy. We like that easy button. Who can we promote? Oh, Johnny, he's been here for 20 years and he's really knowledgeable about engineering. Let's make him the manager, the leader, the whatever. And it just doesn't work. And I love that you're talking about those attributes. Oh, so good.
And it's risk. I mean, honestly, it's risk mitigation. Like, it's the reason why there are some organizations that only like recruit from the top 20 business schools, because then the recruiter can be like, oh, if they're not good, not my fault. Like they came from Harvard, right? Yeah. Or, oh, that was the best engineer. Not my fault, versus I have to make a judgment. And this is why I think it's a measurement issue, because we don't have a way of measuring those attributes. So I have to make a judgment. And therefore, if that doesn't work out, it's my responsibility.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a risk mitigation.
Don't you also think that we go really fast? I mean, not HR wise always, but we interview maybe once, maybe twice if you're higher level. But the interview process doesn't go into depth to dig and find out those attributes, to find out your heart, to, know about your mindset, to go deeper. We're just like, again, we want things quick. We like to skip over the process that it takes to know someone well, or to go through the experience to learn about those things. And as leaders, we like to skip over. I don't want to go through hardship. Skip. I don't want the process.
Well, it's interesting. Recently, we were working with a client to help them select internally a C-suite role. And so what was interesting about it was that when we first talked to them, they were going to do it very quickly. And I was like, hold on. If you were going to select someone externally, what would your process be? And they laid out this very extensive process with like 4 levels of interviews. And I was like, so what is it that makes you think that you don't need a process to select this? And so so this is sort of, again, where my sports background comes in. When I coached, and we coach rugby, we measure everything. Like, they've got GPS trackers on the back. We know how fast they've run. We know how many hits they've had. We code everything, so we can look at every player's interaction, every action that they've taken, and we have all of this data. And the way that I use data is I use it as a check to what I called my coaching eye. So I'd watch the game and I'd have an opinion, and then I'd look at the data and I'd be like, okay, does this data reinforce my opinion, or does it challenge my opinion? And if it challenges my opinion, I'm open to changing it, and then I go back and I watch again. Right. And that's generally how we use data. So we set up a selection criteria where we, as much as we can, measure the attributes and the mindset. and we do it through behavioral interviews, and we do it through sort of like case study work, right? And we get all this data. We build a scorecard, and the goal of the scorecard is not to make the selection. The goal of the scorecard is to check the intuition of the selecting committee, to be like, you thought candidate A was by far the best candidate, but when you look at the data, candidate A is not like even in the top 3. All right, let's go back. So let's pause. Let's review the data. And then maybe there's another round of interviews we need to have. What did they miss? Is it that, you know, because you have all these biases that exist. And so I think creating robust internal selection processes is an investment. Like this C-suite's going to be there for 5 years. Why are you going to rush it? I think that's really critical. And by the way, the outcome of that work is feedback to the person that got the job, which is like, hey, we did all this work. Here's your data. Here's what you're good at. Here are the challenges that you're going to face, right? It helps them not go into leadership shock because it helps them be intentional in that new role.
Absolutely. That's such a good point. And stop interviewing people and going off your gut and your first impression. Go deeper. Look at their mindset, find their attributes, because those things, I love it. They're malleable. They're changing. I think of, the growth mindset versus the fixed. You don't want people, because those are so hard to change. And once they're in that spot, you've kind of just messed up.
I recently met a potential coaching client that, like talking with them, I'm like, in my head, I'm like, you're kind of a fixed mindset person. Like you've been really successful, and the way that you're talking about your challenges, none of it is about you. Right. Yeah. And then I'm like, how did they choose someone to be in this role that's very dynamic, that isn't open to change? Like there's really a selection failure right there to have someone, maybe, growth mindset's always better, but maybe there are some roles that do work when someone's very fixed and that, and it is, you've done it before, we want you to do it. But when you're talking about a dynamic context that's changing, like their ability to be agile and their ability to change is number one on the list. So how did you choose someone that didn't have those attributes and that mindset? Right? That's exactly like they chose on skills, they chose on experience.
Man, you have given so much wisdom. You've talked about us personally. What are the symptoms of leadership shock? You've talked about kind of how do we get out of it and how do we learn to adapt to the new environment? Then you've talked about the hiring process. What about those emerging leaders in the company? How can we look to and prepare better emerging leaders that are more agile and adaptive and have these attributes so that we're building this pipeline of great people within our company so that they're ready for that and they don't have leadership shock? You're going to have a little bit of it. Like you said, there's a difference between 2 weeks and 6 months. How do we build that pipeline?
Well, I would say that the interesting thing about the authentic leadership model as an executive coach is that if I do a good job as a coach, they never have to call me again, because it's a way of thinking about your leadership, right? It's a way of being intentional, and it's a way of connecting different aspects. And I have a podcast coming out on leadership shock, and I have a client that I worked with when she was moved like early on in her career, when she was moving into director and she just got the VP role. And I haven't worked with her for many years. And she said, "Oh, and Pete, in my new role, I just got out my authentic leadership model." And I was checking it. And I'm just like, that's a client that got away, but it's not, right? So I think part of it is if you help people learn how to lead intentionally, that's a skill. And I talk in the book, and I talk with my clients about being metacognitive, which is not just reflecting, but deep reflecting on why you're reflecting that way. If you teach people those skills, then in whatever environment they're in, they were able to stop, be really intentional, be like, what's going on? What do I want to achieve? How am I going to achieve it? And it keeps them out of leadership shock. So one is, I think it's a skill. The second thing I would say is nature's response to complexity, and our world is getting more complex, is diversity. Okay. And so one of the things that we need to be more comfortable with is helping people get a diverse experience. And that might mean leaving our organization. Having someone in your organization for 20 years comes with strengths, but it also comes with huge challenges. Having someone who's been with your organization for 15 years and has gone and worked somewhere else for 5, in the middle of that is really powerful because they bring in lots of different learnings. They bring in a diverse mindset. And so I think finding ways to create diverse experiences and different experiences and letting people experiment in those different experiences, I think is a challenge that we have for our emerging leaders.
Oh, absolutely. Because we like what's comfortable, right?
Yeah,
And
that's
they're a good
right.
employee. I don't want them to leave. Yeah. It's all
Of
the
course you don't.
challenges.
Of
Yeah.
course you don't.
I feel like we've come full circle. You started off talking about your coaching experience and about, going to the Olympics, World Cups, and your job is done by the day that you get there because you have taught them so well. And here you are talking about being a leadership coach. And whenever you have coached them well and
I
they have
know.
the skill sets they need, it's like you've worked
They're
yourself out
gone.
of a job. But yeah, we've come
I
full circle.
there's an endorser on the book called Scott McDonald that I worked with at Oliver Wyman when he first became the CEO. And I don't think Scott and I have talked. We bumped into each other maybe a couple of times. I worked with him for about 6 months. A couple of times we bumped into each other in the hallway.
Yeah.
And it was literally like, I have no idea what he thought about it. And so I reached out to him. He's now the CEO of the British Council. And I said, Scott, would you be willing to endorse the book? And he's like, absolutely, Pete. Like the work that we did together was transformational in how I led. And I'm like, I had no idea. But what I would say is, I know I did a pretty good job because he didn't reach back out to me.
There
He
you
didn't
go.
ask for more help. Like if he's able to go off and take take what he learned from our work together and was able to continue to imply it, and it was transformational, then he shouldn't have to reach out to me. So I kind of always suspected, but until he told me that when I reached out to him, and I probably had spoken to him for 10 years when I reached out to him.
Wow.
I was like, oh, okay. It makes me feel good about myself that I had that impact.
Yeah, you had a huge impact, man. So thinking about everything that you've shared with us, because I have already ordered this book. I'm so excited. I can't wait to get it in. It just came out. What are some key takeaways for our listeners that they need to apply and grow in leadership based upon all the wisdom that you've just shared with us?
So I think the concept of intentionality is really important. One of the challenges that we have is that the word mindfulness has kind of been taken over, right? Like being mindful is actually being intentional. So finding time in your day to stop and think and be intentional, I think is probably the number one thing. And in the post-COVID world, it's harder. It used to be that we had our commute. So we'd have 35 minutes, an hour in the car on the way there, on the way back. We could think about stuff. Now our commute is opening up our laptop. So that time is gone. So finding time to be intentional and to really stop and think, I think is one. The second thing is really finding connections to the way you lead to things that are important to you. Leadership shock is not sustainable. And one of the reasons it's not sustainable is it's not authentic, which means that you're not leading in the way that is really true to yourself. And because you're not leading in the way that's really true to yourself, it's draining. Like it doesn't make you feel good. And so finding ways to connect to your purpose and to your strengths is so critical for things to be sustainable. And then the third thing is treat your time as your most valuable resource. I was working with the president of a business unit of a client, and he was really struggling. And I reached out to a former client that I hadn't worked with for 5 years, but was so good at time management. And what she said to me was, I asked her, I said, how do you manage your time? And she said, if the meeting is not going to move the stock price, I'm not in the meeting.
Wow.
I should not be in a meeting to make an idea 2% better. That is not a good return on my time. And many of the clients I work with are in meetings to make ideas 2% better.
Yeah.
And I think so.
That's
Being
such
intentional.
clarity.
Yeah, I know. It became really easy. I'm like, oh, that's really that's a great way to manage your hey, it has to be important enough. And then my input has to be valuable enough that my input is going to change something. Those are the two things that I think really interesting ways to think about where you spend your time.
You have given us so much wisdom and application as well. And thank you for tying it into stories because so many people that you've talked about, I'm like, I can see myself in that role doing that same thing, or I have felt that.
Yeah.
And so just thank you. So where can our listeners go to learn more about you and your work? And where can we go to get your book?
All right. So you can get my book at the largest book seller in the world at Amazon.
Uh-huh.
Leadership Shock. Like I always like to say, hey, if you love the book, leave a review. If you don't love the book, tell me because I appreciate the feedback.
Mhm.
So that's the way it works. But and then if you want to go to petesteinberg.com, you'll be able to find out more about me and the work that I do. You can sign up for a newsletter. We do a Leadership Shock newsletter every month that kind of highlights things that we're seeing. And then, of course, connect with me on LinkedIn. Love to be connected on
Perfect.
LinkedIn. Another way to follow me. If you want to stay up to date on rugby stuff, you can connect with me on Twitter. But I'm going to guess there aren't many rugby fans that are leadership on the rocks listeners. If they are, you can find me on
Mhm.
Twitter. That's mostly what I
Well,
do on
so
Twitter.
let me confess to you. So in my church, there's some people that play rugby, and they went to the World Cup, I think, in Ireland a couple of years ago. So there are a few out there, and I know they're going to
Oh,
be like,
they're out
"What,
there.
Bethany?
Yep,
You
yep,
interviewed this person? I know
yep.
them."
They're out there.
Absolutely. And thank you so much. And I got to ask you this: what is one poor decision that you would warn our leaders to avoid? Like, come on, don't do this. You're better than that.
Um, so this is I'm going to go back to my time, and I'm going to tell a story, right? Because we're a storytelling species.
Mhm.
So I was working with a client who was in leadership shock, and they didn't have time to meet with me. So I met with their chief of staff, and we pulled out their calendar, and we started working their way through the calendar. And I looked out 2 months from now, and I say, well, what's that meeting? You've got a meeting with a vendor. It's 2 months from now. Like, why is that meeting there? And the chief of staff said, oh, well, the leader doesn't have time this week to meet with them. So, but they had time 2 months from now. And I was like, okay. But a week before that time, 2 months from now, is the leader going to be really busy? And she's like, oh, yeah,
Mhm.
like, they're always busy. I'm like, okay. So what is it that's different about that hour than's different
Mhm.
about the hour that you have now? So I think the big thing that I would say is, and the big mistake that people make is they discount the time in the future, right? Do not discount
Mhm.
the hour 2 months from now is worth as much as the hour you have this week. So if it's not worth putting on your calendar for this week, don't put it on your calendar 2 months from now.
That is so good. So good. I love your perspective on that. Mr. Steinberg, thank you so much for being on the podcast. You have just given us so much wisdom, and we just thank you so much for being here and sharing it with us. And everybody go out and buy Leadership Shock. I know that you're either going through that, have gone through that, or going to go through it in the future. So you need this book.
Thanks, Bethany. This has been a great discussion. I've learned a lot and I appreciate being on the podcast.
And thank you. All right, guys, until next time, continue putting in the work of building your life and leadership on the rocks, the essential rocks. God bless. Remember, the most essential rock you can build your life and leadership on is the rock of Jesus Christ. Today's Bible verse comes from Isaiah chapter 43, verse 19. Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. Hey, it's Bethany again. If you're enjoying the Leadership on the Rocks podcast, be sure to subscribe and follow so you don't miss a single episode. Also, be sure to rate the show. We hope to earn 5 stars in serving you in leadership, and through your ratings, it'll help us get the word out about what we do here at Leadership on the Rocks. If you feel this podcast is helpful, be sure to share it with your friends, family, and coworkers, or anyone who wants to grow in leadership, but also have harmony between their work and home life. Thanks, and I'll see you again in the next episode.